Thank you for coming tonight. I know it's a very busy night. I'm Amy Chen. I'm with Think Chinatown, and I bring my own cheering section. So this is the second in our April is Lit at Think Chinatown event. And if those of you who don't know Think Chinatown, we are a place-based nonprofit here in Manhattan, Chinatown. We work at the intersection of storytelling, civic engagement, and the arts. We are a nonprofit, so if you enjoy our programs, tell your friends. I want to say that we run a lot of cultural programs throughout the year. And in October, we do have a very big event. It's called Chinatown Arts Fest. So stay tuned for that. Coming up in May, we have the Chinatown Storytelling Festival, which is a series of films and short animations. And we'll be holding that at DCTV, Downtown Community TV Theater over on Center Street. As part of our Lit Month this month, we had S.J. Rosen last week. We have the event tonight. Next week, we have an event that I'm told is sold out right now. We're screening Daughters of Shanghai with Katie Salisbury, who wrote an autobiography, a biography of Anna May Wong. And that will be on the 15th. And on the 26th, we are having a free playwriting workshop here that also includes free dinner. So if any of you are playwriting curious, please sign up for that. There are flyers. I have one here. It will be taught by Alvin Eng, who is also our interviewer tonight. So pick up one of these flyers and tell your friends. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If anybody needs to use the facilities, it's out in the small room there on your right. In honor of tonight's No.10 Doyers Street event, we also have a selection of snacks over there by the open door by the kitchen. And the snacks were inspired by a menu from the Man Farlow restaurant that used to be on Pell Street in 1904. So we have some things like dried lychee. We also have little almond cakes. These were the kinds of things that were served at the turn of the century in Chinatown as dessert. So just a little bit of taste. And if you are hungry after the event, we have a list outside of local restaurants that are open a little bit later. So please, go and frequent the restaurants here in Manhattan, Chinatown. So now I want to introduce our highlight tonight, Radha Vatsal. Radha is the author of No.10 Doyers Street, and she's the acclaimed Kitty Weeks mystery series set in World War II era New York. Her works appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Los Angeles Review of Books, Crime Reads, and more. Born and raised in Mumbai, India, she holds a PhD in film history from Duke University and has worked as a film curator, political speechwriter, freelance journalist, and she is the 2024-2025 fellow at the CUNY Writers Institute, and she resides here in New York City. And then later in the program, we'll have Alvin Eng in a short conversation with Radha. Alvin is a native New York City playwright, and he is a memoirist, a performer, acoustic punk guitar rock on tour, punk rock on tour. Say that 10 times fast. And an educator, and his plays and performances have been seen off-Broadway throughout the US, as well as in Paris, Hong Kong, and Guangzhou, China. His recent memoir, Our Laundry, Our Town, which is fabulous, My Chinese American Life from Flushing to the Downtown Stage and Beyond, was published in hardcover by Fordham University Press in 2022, and he is a 2024-2025 long-term fellow at the New York Public Library, and he's researching a companion book to his memoir right now. So we're just really happy to have both of them here. And I'm going to hand it over to Radha, who's going to enlighten us about this amazing historical novel that she has written. Thank you, Radha.
Amy, for inviting me, to Alvin for joining me in conversation, and to everyone who's come here this evening. So I am going to read very briefly just the opening of the novel, and then I want to take you through some slides that kind of go through all the real, describe a little bit the real people who are characters in the novel and the real places. So this novel is set in 1907 in Chinatown, and the only thing is, for those of you who are very up to speed on your Chinatown history, it opens with this event which was known as the Chinese Opera House Massacre that took place in 1905. That was the one place where I decided I would give myself the liberty to telescope time, and so that's the only thing that's like chronologically slightly out, but it opens with that event. So the bump in the road came out of nowhere, or rather everywhere. Constant use and shoddy repairs had left the streets and sidewalks cratered and veined, but usually I kept my wits about me. Usually I didn't trip and have to catch myself. That day, however, a swarm of newsmen buzzing uptown grabbed my attention. I waited a few seconds for them to pass and then followed, a small matchstick-like figure in trousers, jacket, and a hat, scarcely worthy of notice. The skies were light and vendors were out. The air had lost winter's sting and spring was just beginning to take hold. I kept the newshounds in my sight as I dodged the crowds. Something out of the ordinary must have taken place. The pressmen streamed past City Hall and the Tweed Courthouse, past the sumptuous Hall of Records and the Brooklyn Bridge. They continued beneath the elevated railroad tracks, skipped Mott Street, and hooked a quick left on Doyers. No more than a few 100 feet long and maybe 10 or 12 feet wide, the street hung from Pell like a sock on a line, bent sharply at the heel, and emptied out onto Chatham Square and the Bowery. The newsmen slowed as they approached the curve. It was known as the Bloody Angle because it had been the site of so many shootings. A lone copper stood on guard in front of wooden double doors below a metal fire escape. Locals milled around outside, ashen-faced and in silence. A sign read, Chinese Opera House. The newsmen went in. The copper looked me up and down. I'd never covered the district. My editor believed it wasn't a job for a woman. And you are? The copper asked. With the Observer. It was a scrappy, by your bootstraps rag to be sure, but not unknown among New York's dozens of dailies. The copper frowned, muttered something under his breath, but grudgingly stepped aside, allowing me to enter. Once inside, it took a few moments to adjust to the dim light. Then I made out the scene. A stage had been set for a performance, but the ornate backdrop had been punctured with bullet holes, so many that it almost looked intentional. Benches placed in neat rows for the audience had toppled helter-skelter. Shattered glass glittered. Bodies lay sprawled on the floor. I counted 4. They were pulled in their own blood, eyes wide open. I rested my head against one of the metal columns, trying to breathe, while the coppers replied to the newsmen's questions. It was the onlyons and the hips at each other's throats again. In the middle of a performance? That's right, but this time they've crossed the line. The theater's supposed to be neutral territory. Do we know who fired first? The hips. Who planned the attack? Cackles in the gloom. There was no need to answer. So, I guess we'll get to it with the slides, but the belief at the time when the shooting occurred was that Mocked Up, who's the leader of the Hip Sing Tong, was behind it, and I'll just read a little paragraph that describes who he was, and then we can move on to the slides. Scarcely out of his 20s, Mock Duck was already a local legend. His dead, expressionless eyes gazed from the backs of playing cards and souvenir matchboxes. Street urchins sang ditties in his honor. They said he could hear a pin drop, that he could see around corners, and that his rhinoceros thick skin protected him from injury. But I wanted to find out who he really was, what fueled his enmity with the Onlyons, and most importantly, whether he truly believed he could flout all the rules so brazenly and get away with it. No one had seen him at the theater. His alibi was unassailable. When the shooting occurred, he had been bailing out a couple of friends right under the noses of the cops at the police station. It was almost too rich, as though he was daring the authorities to arrest him. As I scoured the newspapers more for old reports, I discovered that this was a pattern with Mock. Although he'd been implicated in and arrested for dozens of crimes, he always managed to produce a watertight alibi or hire expert lawyers and argue his way out of the situation. In one instance, when he was identified by a white witness, Mock maintained that the witness must have been wrong since all Chinese look the same to Americans. Thank you. So if we can move on. Yeah, so here's Mock Duck. This is a mugshot of him from 1904, and he was the leader of the Hip Sing Tong, which and tell me if I'm saying things that everyone here knows, but these were benevolent societies that were set up to help newcomers adjust, find a job, find a place to stay when they came to the US, but they were also involved in other activities. In this novel, the main activity, illegal activity that they were involved in was gambling, and the Hip Sing Tong, which Mock was supposed to be the leader of, and the An Liang Tong were fighting over territory. So Mock was a young man, and as I said in the section I read out, he sort of came from San Francisco. He was born in San Francisco. He came to New York, and he didn't wait his turn. He sort of started really taking over the area. Soon he developed this huge reputation. He was a legend in Chinatown, and he was arrested. Anything would go wrong, any crime, the police would first think of Mock Duck and arrest him, and still, they never managed to convict him because he was really good at using the law to his own advantage. So if we go to the next slide, Mock was, he's a young guy. He has this wife, Tai Yao, and together they have a little daughter. She's adopted. And this story is actually really not so much about Mock's criminal activities as it is about the case that he fights for his daughter. Because what happens very early on in the novel, so I'm not giving anything away, and this really did happen, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, which had recently been formed, raided Mock's home, and they took away this 6-year-old daughter, and then Mock had to fight in the courts to get her back. So the next slide, this is Tom Lee. He was the self-proclaimed mayor of Chinatown, and earlier on in the 19th century, he'd even been appointed sheriff. He had the sheriff's badge. He was very proud of that, and he understood that because of the Exclusion Act, since Chinese weren't allowed to vote, that they needed to find different ways to get some political power. So he was always very involved in his community. He would donate to politicians of all stripes, Republican, Democrat, he didn't care. He donated to win some level of political power for himself and his community. And he and Mock Duck were sworn enemies, and in the early 1900s, they had like this kind of escalating series of confrontations, their two gangs, including this big, very famous shootout at the Chinese Theater. So the next slide. Sure. So this was the mayor of New York City at the time. His name is George B. McClellan. He was the son of a Civil War general by the same name. And this novel takes place in 1907. Little less than 10 years previously, in 1898, the city consolidated into the city of 5 boroughs that we know today. So all the 5 boroughs came together to form Greater New York. And then there was this question: what is this big city going to be like? What kind of infrastructure are we going to have? How are we going to get water to people? All these questions. And McClellan was an interesting guy. He had like a very strong aesthetic sense. He'd been educated at Princeton. People were very impressed. He was a reading, literate mayor, and he had these ideas that many of which we would agree with. He wanted more schools, he wanted more libraries and everything. But also, Chinatown as an immigrant community had this reputation first it had like the way, unfortunately, even today, all this rhetoric around immigrants and criminality. So that was very much a part of the time. And McClellan decides, well, the way we solve this problem about not having enough open space in the city, particularly in this area, which is so heavily populated, we're gonna raze Chinatown, we're gonna destroy it and replace it with a park. And that happens at the same time. So Mark is faced with these two competing pressures. One is to get his daughter back, and the other is this pressure that the city is exerting of wanting to raze all of Chinatown and replace it with a park. And the story, the I in the story, I don't know if is a woman. So the story is told from the perspective of a woman journalist from India, and I've told this story before. But basically, when I first learned about Mark Duck through this story with his daughter, and I realized immediately that I wanted to tell this story, but I couldn't figure out which perspective to tell it from. I didn't feel that I could just simply tell it in third person and immediately kind of understand what was going on in the mind of a gangster 100 years ago from a totally different culture. So I knew that the story had to be told from the perspective of a narrator. Then the question was who this narrator would be. I felt like I needed to have an Indian narrator who would have my perspective. But basically, I had never heard about Indians being in the US in the early part of the 1900s. So I struggled with this actually for a couple of years until finally I decided, okay, New York had a population of 2 million people at that time. It's a port city, there are people coming from everywhere. I'm just gonna make a guess that one of those people is from India, and I'm gonna make her a woman, and that's just my decision, I'm gonna do it. And so I did, and then the minute I did, I was like, oh, wait a minute, let me check. You know, the block in my mind about there not being people from India at the time, because we never hear about them, was so strong that it didn't even occur to me to look it up. Well, it turns out there were women from India in the US, and this is one of them. Her name is Dr. Anandibai Joshi, and she came here in the 1880s to study medicine in Philadelphia. And she's here in a picture with someone from Tokyo and someone from Damascus. And all these women from all over the world actually came to the medical school in Philadelphia to study medicine. And Anandibai lived here, I think, for 3 or 5 years, and she qualified to become an OBGYN. And she did her whole course in her sari and maintaining her vegetarian diet. And if we go to the next slide. So the other woman who came at the same time is Pandita Ramabai, who toured the country, who toured the US, talking about the plight of Hindu child women and child brides. And then when she went back to India in the 1880s, she actually wrote a book, which I find fascinating, called Conditions of Life in the United States. And we know about de Tocqueville and democracy in America as like this account by a foreigner of the US at a particular time, but nobody ever hears about conditions of life in the United States. And I think it's so, even today, I feel like big histories of the country are usually written by men, usually written by white men. And the fact that this woman from India just decided, I'm gonna write a book called Conditions of Life in the United States, and then did it, I think is pretty incredible. So the narrator of the novel, Archana Morley, was imagined first, but then is based on them. We can move to the next slide. So the novel really takes place in Lower Manhattan, and much of this, so the Brooklyn Bridge, which you see at the bottom, was built at the time of the novel. The Manhattan Bridge had not yet been completed, so it was just like these archways dangling over the East River and these lines of metal chains, and it was waiting, the roadway still hadn't been attached to the chains, which I think is a pretty incredible thing. And if we go to the next slide, Archana works downtown. Actually, we can go to the next slide too. You can see it better. So this is today's Park Row. I don't know if you're still familiar with it. This is City Hall. We usually see the big municipal building here, which is the one with the gold statue on the top, but at that time it didn't exist. And Park Row here was called Newspaper Row because it was where all the newspapers were located. And so they would be here, and City Hall is here, so they get to like keep close tabs on what's going on in city government. And at the time of the novel, actually, so all the newspapers are down here, except for the New York Times, which had recently moved uptown to 42nd Street, which was then named Times Square, and the New York Herald, which had moved uptown to 34th, which was named Herald Square. So we can move to the next slide. And then, so Archana would have walked past, gone up to come from City Hall. She would have walked uptown and then on the Bowery. And at the time, the Bowery had it had elevated trains going over it on two sides for the trains going one in each direction. And it was a very seedy street with a lot of brothels and flop houses and cheap hotels there. Next. And this is now Columbus Park, but it was known as Mulberry Bend Park, and it was located in the neighborhood of 5 Points, which was a very European immigrant neighborhood, and it also had a reputation for crime. So Mulberry Bend, which was where Mulberry Street, which is up here, where it bends, was like considered the worst part where all the worst criminals hung out. And in the 19th century, in a similar idea of logic, how do we clean up this area? How do we, quote unquote, clean up this area and make it better? They decided, oh, we'll just destroy the tenements that are here and replace it with a park. So they put in this Mulberry Bend Park, which we still have. But what I find interesting, and there was a lot of people back then thought of parks and playgrounds. There was like a Playground Association of America. They thought of it as a civilizing thing. It was a way to teach newcomers how to get used to the ways of the country, of the United States. And this park is very interesting because it's like basically a park for poor people. It has very clean lines of sight. You know, there's nothing, it's not like Central Park with all these curving, pads and big trees obscuring your view. Here it is so that you can just see right through, nobody can get up to any mischief. That was very key to have this very kind of basic plain park with no topography. We can go to the next picture. And sorry, that was the park, which is just, so it's here, and you see Doyers, which I love. Look, it's such a little crooked street, but it's like right there. And so this is the plan. I don't think they were thinking, oh, they're going to expand the park here, but they're like, oh, we've done this park here. Why not replicate it over there as well in Chinatown? So we can go to the next slide. And here is Mott Street in Chinatown in around 1907. And Tom Lee owned a tobacco store on Mott Street. And Chinatown at the time was concentrated on the three streets, Pell, Mott, and Doyers. Those three little streets. It was a triangle almost. And we can go to the next. And this is a very famous place called the Pelham Cafe on Pell Street. And so, these neighborhoods, even though it was primarily Chinese, it wasn't exclusively Chinese. The Pelham Cafe was owned by a Jewish guy called Mike Salter. You can see his name written here, M. Salter. And it was a place where all the fancy people used to come when they wanted to go slumming and like visit Chinatown and see what was going on. So the Astors and the Vanderbilts and stuff would come to the Pelham Cafe and then take tours around Chinatown. And Mike Salter used to hire singing waiters to entertain his audience. And in 1907, one of those singing waiters was a young man who would later become known as Irving Berlin. So while Mock Duck is doing his thing, you have Irving Berlin just a few feet away singing to whoever wrote this thing. And then the last image. This is, of course, Doyers Street with the famous bend in it. And Mock Duck lived right on number 10, hence the title for the book. He's right on the curve and right opposite the opera house where the shooting takes place. So that's just a little overview of the book. And now I'll invite Alvin.
Hello everyone, hello. Hello, okay. Well, what a great presentation, thank you so much. And thanks again for having us here at that Think Chinatown, April Lit Night. Okay, so we start with some origin stories. Why don't you tell us about how, I guess 2 origin stories, but I guess how you became a writer and then how you came to write No.10 Doyers Street.
I always have enjoyed reading so much, which is why I think a lot of people start writing. And I used to work in film. I actually came to my understanding of this period, and the reason I do so much work in this period is because I study silent film, and I find it fascinating. But a lot of the stuff that I learned about silent cinema and the world as it was then, I wanted to sort of make more accessible to people. So when my first child was born, I was like, okay, I'm gonna try to write and let's see what happens. And so I wrote my first 2 novels, which are set a little bit later during the 1910s, but that's how I started writing. I just wanted to see if I could do it.
Mm-hmm. And what brought you to this story, these tales, and what ultimately became No.10 Doyers Street?
So I was really trying to find what my next book would be, and I went back to film actually, and so there was this, and I was looking through the New York Times Time Machine, which has like these archives, so you can search them and just look at old newspaper stories, which I like to do. And I came across this one guy, Vincent Pissarra was his name. He was with the Children's Society, and he was going around trying to close all these little movie theaters because he thought they were bad for kids and like for people in general. He would say the reason that girls go wrong is because of rides, reels, and rum. So movies, cars, and alcohol. But so I was just sort of following Vincent Pissarra through the archives and seeing the stories that came out that I found in the Times about him. And then I came across this story, which was called Cruelty. It was titled Cruelty Sought at Mock Ducks. And it was this story about how Pissarra and his colleague raided Mock Duck's home. And at first, when I read it, it was so racist. Like I couldn't even, my mind couldn't wrap itself around. I couldn't even understand half of what they were saying because I thought, is this reporter trying to be funny? What is going on? There are all kinds of jokes and the little ducks were swimming in the Pell Street pond. And it didn't feel at all even like contemporary journalism. But the story fascinated me, and despite the racism, you could see that the reporter was also affected by the taking away of this little girl. And then I started following that story in the papers, and a few papers did report on this case.
And also, so a lot of this is based on historical fact.
Right.
Tell us about tell us about your research on that, a little more about that.
Yeah, so this book actually, it's strange, I didn't realize that most of the characters, I would say 80% of the characters are actual people who lived. And the main character who is fictional is the narrator and her husband, but otherwise most people in the book has a list of people at the beginning. Nearly all of them actually existed. And so to write it, I did have to do a lot of research. And the thing is with the Chinese characters, there's certainly less in English, but there's just less documented about them the same way as it is about any, I think, minority characters. They just have less documentation. But I looked through newspapers to really find out about them. And then for McClellan and things like that, there was more material, but even he as a mayor has been forgotten, but he wrote up his memoirs. And then I do a lot of research with maps, and I even went to the Surrogates Court, which is the Hall of Records downtown, to get city, the city had this thing called the Board of Estimate, which would make a lot of decisions on how land was used. So I looked at that as well to try to get the historical record of how things happened.
And it seems like, was it the taking away of the child that really grabbed you just as much as the legend of Mock Duck too?
Yeah, I feel like what grabbed me was here's this guy who people were terrified of and who just had this reputation for huge brutality, but then he has such a human side, which you see with the way he fights for his 6-year-old daughter. And then later I read, there was an article about him written in the 1930s in the New Yorker. And it just, well, I cannot say because it will give too much away, but you can, you see how much this child meant to him. So it was this human side of this very fierce man, but also this story that his struggle and the reason they took her away and things, if you read the book, it just tells you so much about how strange our notions of race were. She was mixed race, and then things start going really crazy, and you read it, and I'll just tell you that it's all true, what happened. It's like I couldn't make up what actually happened because the truth is so crazy.
And in the last chapter, no, I'm not going to give it away. So always as readers of historical fiction, as writers of historical fiction, we're always thinking about how do you balance like the era in which it takes place. Like in your case, how are you always balancing 1907 Chinatown with 2025 readers and writers? What are the expectations of the different eras?
Yeah, it's very tricky. And how do you do that without like? How do you do that in a way that like conveys some of the kind of mentality of the time without being offensive today? It's a tricky balance, and I feel like one way is having a narrator who also can understand and faces some of these prejudices. But the other thing that I did was I actually incorporate a lot of the newspaper accounts into the novel. So the quotes from newspapers that are in the novel are almost verbatim the way they appeared. Like maybe I've reordered things, but the language is the same. And what I found also in these newspapers is how interesting it was where they actually contradict each other. And sometimes you wonder, did the reporter actually see this, or are they just imagining? Like, are they, like, it's almost like they're writing a novel about it. And I include all of that in the book, and the narrator actually wonders about it herself. Like, did they actually see it or did they not?
Right. As a researcher and a rock and roll fan, I always come back to that great Talking Heads lyric, facts are good, facts are true, but facts don't do what I want them to.
Right.
So, did you come across that as you were shaping your story and based on?
Yeah, because there's a central part where like they're talking about it as if it's a fact. And I was like, it's not making sense to me. I really strive, again, I can't, there were definitely things where I was just that were presented as if they were fact, and they don't fit today's definition of a fact. And so I kind of had to problematize them a little bit and have the narrator think that they were problematic too, because I couldn't think of any other way to handle them.
Right. Another balancing act of historical fiction and all writing, like how do you balance like what you learned in your research, and then balance that with your portraits of these people and of this era? Like you said, you changed the date of the opera massacre, but how were you struggling with any other like balancing again between the historical research and then how you wanted to create these characters?
Yeah, I mean, I just found that so with Mock Duck, I felt he is so strongly depicted in the press, but also the accounts of him are so contradictory. So some will say he's an expert marksman, but others will say he like closes his eyes and just shoots blindly. And some accounts will call him fat and some will call him thin, and you know, like there's a lot of contradiction there. So with Mock, what I had a really interesting time doing was that because he's already a legend in his own time, everybody is talking about him in these overblown terms. And the narrator is always having to wonder, well, is this real, or are just people making up these stories the way we would about a movie star, like, oh, I heard so-and-so did this, and I heard so-and-so did that. Did they really do it? We don't know. Like, so much about Mock is about the aura of Mock Duck. So that was really like, but this book like took me forever to write, and I feel like I could still just keep writing it because these characters in real life were so fascinating.
And just about the creation of the narrator, who's the reporter. A lot of times there's symbolism in a character's name. Archie, Archana, did that?
Archana, yeah.
Yes, and how did that come about for you?
I just felt like I needed a name that could have a short form. So people call her Archie. Her husband calls her Archie. I wanted an Indian name that could still be shortened into something that would sound Western, though she's not. She's not necessarily. So that name. Just the minute I decided to do it, that name popped in my mind, and that was what it was.
Right. And to me, one of the spines of the book really that speaks just as much in 1907 as it does to us here in 2025 is really the main axis of the book is really justice, law, race, class. As they always say, it's not a court of justice, it's a court of law. And talk about how I assume you have a lot to say about that in the book and in that, and how things changed and not.
I think a lot of things are the same. I feel like it's about justice, race, law, and since it's New York City, real estate. Like who gets to decide what gets built, what property stays, which neighborhoods can remain, which neighborhoods get destroyed. Like that's all part of the book. I mean, I wasn't thinking about it, but really, as I was doing the research and figuring out how these processes and how decisions were made, even in the 1900s, about how do you change a neighborhood in New York City? How do you destroy a neighborhood? Like they had to go through certain processes, and even reading about that, it just felt so reminiscent about, it just really mirrored what's happening today and who gets heard and who doesn't get heard. And that's why I think both Mock and Tom Lee are very interesting characters, because they have their own approach to power. Mock sort of does everything behind the scenes, you never know, did he do it or not? What is he doing? He's in the limelight, but nobody actually knows what he does. Tom Lee was really playing this game where he was trying to influence politicians, trying to do these, to be able to get some political power more overtly through donations and things like that. I don't know, I just, it really does map onto today very well.
Very, very much so. There's different sets of laws. They can get away with just saying that just by virtue of the child having.
Are you getting it away?
Oh, just by yes. So just the child. Yes. Sorry. Thanks for cutting me off there. Sorry. So we'll go back to and talk about the cross cultural things. One of those moving scenes is when the reporter presses a Ganesha into. Talk about that, how that came about.
Yeah, so Mock's wife doesn't speak English, and you see that in the newspaper reports, and it's really very moving because she's in this courtroom also trying to get her daughter back, and she doesn't speak English, and she has to go through an interpreter who is her neighbor who does speak English, but of course then she and the reporter can't speak, and so there is a moment where, but they still, I feel, can understand each other. And so there's this moment where she gives her a little Ganesh, which is a little Indian token of his little god, elephant-headed god, and she gives the wife that at a certain moment.
Right. Very, very key moment. And also, I guess another 21st century issue that a lot of writers are facing. I guess artists, and people of all concerns, like the issue of I guess the slippery slope of representation. We talked about that. Like, yes, on one hand, we want accurate, respectful representation, but yet also then as artists, as writers, we don't want to be told that you just stay in your lane. You only write about, like in my case, you only write about Chinese American characters. And I guess your thoughts on that, and how you navigate and negotiate that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was what was so tricky about writing this book, and why I didn't want to write it in the third person, like without having a clear narrator. I think that if you do your research, and then everybody can have a perspective. We all live together. We're all interacting together. We can have perspectives on other cultures. We have perspective on our own culture. And I think if you have something told from the perspective, if you know the perspective that it's coming from, and the narrator's perspective is inherently limited. We all have just limited perspectives. And so I felt like, it was a little nerve-wracking, but I felt like that's precisely why I wanted to make her an Indian character, because I felt like, okay, so she's gonna have whatever shortfalls I have, but also whatever insights I can bring to the situation as a foreigner also, but not as the same kind of foreigner. So the story needed a little bit of an outside and a little bit of an inside to be told. But I do believe that, we can respectfully. Otherwise, we're all just like hemmed into our own lanes, and the thing is, like, do I understand Indian people more than I understand other people? I don't think so necessarily. Do I understand myself? Sometimes you don't even, understand yourself so well. So,
especially for us Geminis.
I'm on Libra, so maybe.
Are we coming? Are we going? What's going on here? So, yes. So in that way too, it's great that it's just again, to toot the horn of our hosts, like that's why I think Chinatown is such an important hub. Like I feel like I've been lucky to be on this journey. I love that first Think Chinatown embraced you to share this book back at the Chinatown Arts Festival, way back in October of 2024, way back when. That was a different time, wasn't it, folks? Okay. So back then, it was lovely to be on that when you first read that, and then to be back here tonight. So with that, and so along those lines, I guess before we open up for questions from the audience, okay, I just want to say, what's the question that no one has asked you yet about the book that you wish someone would?
That is a tough one. I need to think about that.
Okay, great. So we'll open up some questions now, I guess.
Well, I mean, when you do research in the New York Times or the yellow press, a lot of the press was obviously biased and very racist, actually. The actual stories in Chinatown, the reason why it's a secret is because what actually happened, if you go to the Hip Sing archives or the online archives, I'm sure they're not going to allow you to know their stories of what actually happened.
Absolutely, and that's why I foreground the papers. It's very much, the story is very much told from the perspective of an outsider writing for an outside newspaper. So whether the story remains as a story that's told what someone in that position would know, and Mok in the end remains kind of unknowable to her. And that's definitely a key part of the novel.
I'm sorry, could everyone hear the question in the back? Could you hear the question? Yeah. Okay, great. Or do I have to pass the microphone? Okay, great. Because we're under careful instruction that if we do pass the mic around, these are brand new mics for Think Chinatown. So no mic drop, okay? No mic drop, yes, okay. Other questions, please. Other questions in the back, yes.
Did you reach out to any family members or descendants of any of the characters?
I didn't reach out to any descendants because, I didn't. I wanted to keep it very constrained to this. It's actually, the whole novel takes place within a 3-month period. And then with this kid, her records are sealed. So I tried to follow the story of the child, but her records are sealed.
I often like to also let, do you have questions for the audience too? I mean, that's a good way to have the Q&A should go both ways, I feel. Yes.
Yeah, I'm curious. I don't know if anyone wants to talk about what brought you here. Is it is it like the Chinatown history or Doyers Street or? I'm curious.
So, is that hand way in the back there?
Alvin brought me here.
Alvin, well, that's a good one.
I carried him on my shoulders too.
Right.
So you were saying the geography is Mott Street, L Street, Doyers, and so what's the population of Chinatown at this time?
I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think it's like a couple of thousand, and then they would say that like on weekends and stuff when people would come from outside, that it would grow a lot. But there were also, at the time, there were Chinese communities in New Jersey, and Tom Lee himself lived in a house in the Bronx. So he would come down to run his business, but he lived in the Bronx at the time. There were there was a Chinese community in Brooklyn, and then when the news came, like when it looked like Chinatown was about to be destroyed, and we know it wasn't because those streets are still there, but they were looking at different areas where people could move, and one of the areas was Williamsburg and things. But like so much of New York, the boroughs were still unsettled really, or like there was space for movement. 1907, Queensboro Bridge hadn't yet been finished. You know, the city was really under construction at the time. There was a lot of change happening.
So, you talked a little bit about your research process, but can you talk about it a little more, like when you were mapping out, or when you were working on a story, because it's based on actual people and there's real streets. Do you do a visualization that's beyond sort of linear writing? Do you map it out in terms of like how you're gonna structure it, like in terms of, do you do a map or do you do?
Well, I certainly used a map a lot, you know, to look at all the routes and stuff, like, because the geography really matters in this book. And for instance, you know, just like how long does it take to go, how would you walk from Park Row up to Chinatown? What route would you take? And like I had to think about that actually because I don't know if you guys are familiar with Foley Square near the courts, and that's where like there are all these demonstrations and stuff. But back then too, there used to be this guy called Plunkett of Tammany Hall who would stand there giving these lectures about politics of the day, which I incorporated into the novel. So I had to understand what Archana's route would be to see her. And then what is the mayor doing? He used to walk everywhere on foot, and there was no Gracie Mansion at that time. So the mayor had to, whoever the mayor of New York was, they had to like have their own place. They just lived in their own home. This mayor used to complain about it. He would say, like, in order to live in the style in which a mayor of New York City should live, you either have to be very independently wealthy or crooked. He was neither, but he used to rent a home on Washington Square Park, and then he would walk down to work and stuff. So a lot of that, like I look at how you would get from point A to point B. The city, this is another sort of subplot in the book, because the city was expanding, a big question was water supply. And they started work on the Catskills Reservoir, which is where we still get our water today. And so then I had to look at, well, how long does it take to get to the Catskills? Like all of that kind of stuff. So I tried to be very precise about that. And I kept on, I look at maps a lot when I write.
Wow, a New York City mayor that was not corrupt. Wow.
Or rich?
Yeah, he was a Tammany Hall mayor. Yeah, much.
Do you know what the main problem in the book they're trying to solve is? Is it just like trying to like get his kid back from the officials, or is it something else?
So the main problem in book is the sort of inciting problem. There are two. One is that the city wants to destroy Chinatown, and Mak is kind of the strongest guy in Chinatown, and so suddenly these two events are happening at the same time. The city wants to destroy Chinatown, and at the same time, somehow the strongest guy in the city has his child taken away from him. And so she's wondering whether those two things are connected. And she follows them through.
Did you look into why Mak Duck came to Chinatown? In contrast, other story about Tommy was sent by the Six Company. He had a mission. Was Mak Duck more individual, like he decided to come, or was he sent by someone?
It's not clear from the records whether he was sent or whether he came, but whether he came of his own accord. But he was certainly pretty young when he came. Like, it seems like he was in his late teens. And when he comes to Chinatown first, he dresses in Western clothes, like there are photos of him in a jacket and a hat and everything. He looks really snappy. And what he does is he's really so sharp. So he sees that Tom Lee has all these gambling parlors which pay him protection money. And he sees that people in New York want to kind of reform those gambling parlors and get rid of that kind of crime in the area. One of those people is this guy called Reverend Parkhurst. He was a white reformer. And so Mak Duck pretends to help Reverend Parkhurst. And he says, here, I'll give you a list of all the gambling parlors. So he gives Reverend Parkhurst a list of all Tom Lee's gambling parlors. All the heads of those gambling parlors get thrown into jail, and then Mak Duck goes and asks all of them the whatever's left for protection money for him. And so when he first comes, the papers are they call him a Chinese choir boy because he speaks very good English. He's born in this country, so his English is excellent. He carries himself really well. And then slowly people realize, oh, this guy actually is not up to so much good. And then he starts actually dressing in a black tunic and black trousers to sort of merge in partly with everyone else to make himself harder to identify and for people to spot him. And if you look at accounts of what alibis he comes up with, they're quite extraordinary. So at the time of the shooting, he really was at a police station bailing out people. So he was like, oh, it's not me. Then there's this other occasion where he's in jail and the person who's going to testify against him is sleeping on the second floor of a building, and the restaurant beneath it catches on fire. And then the guy who's going to testify against Mak wakes up to find himself in flames, and he jumps off the balcony and he dies. And Mak Duck is like, well, I was in jail. I had nothing to do with it. How could it be me? And he keeps saying it's all me. But of course, mysteriously, everyone around him is dying and falling from balconies and stuff. So he's a very interesting guy.
Could he have been of Russian descent? No.
It was really lovely hearing about your film background and kind of how that was something that inspired, partially inspired this book. I'm wondering if that language or that craft of film analysis is comes out in this, or other films maybe that you were thinking about when writing this,
Yeah, well, I also look at films and old archival footage when I do this work, but I think what studying early cinema taught me and why it attracted me to this period, one of the first things I learned, or one of the early things I learned when I was studying cinema, was that in the early 1900s, most Americans watched French movies. They watched movies from France. The idea that most Americans would watch French movies today is kind of unthinkable. But the reason for that was that Hollywood was not developed. The American film industry was not so developed. So the majority of films in this country were from abroad, and they were from Europe. There are also many women, and this is what I wrote my dissertation on, who made films in the early 1900s. They were producers, they were directors, and all of this was because there was no money in cinema. The minute money comes in, then the women get pushed out. But what it showed me was that this period was very, for us the way we think about America as this sort of global powerhouse with this certain cultural kind of capital and weight behind it, which sadly is being destroyed as we speak. But all of that was not something that just came out of nowhere. It had to be developed. And so I was interested in what did America look like just before America became this country that we know about, like with the Hollywood and the cars and all these big, these things. What was the society like when actually women, and remember we're doing a lot of, they were very involved in all kinds of fields in the early 1900s. And many professional women actually took steps back after they won the right to vote. But so film history was really my introduction to this idea, was that the past is not what we think it is. Yeah?
As a reader, what are elements that like to focus on that would help our appreciation of consuming the book? Or maybe put another way, like as a writer, like what do you try to think about as your like in your writing style, or as you're creating the book?
Yeah. Well, this book, I feel like I'm not a writer who can write long. Like for whatever reason, I'm always like, oh, this is getting boring. Cut, So my books tend to be quite short, and this one is too, despite everything that's in it. I feel like it's a book that could have been much longer, but it's not. It's quite a compressed book. But it does have a lot of characters, which is why at the beginning I've given like a little list of characters, and I've divided them up by, whether they're with City Hall or whether they're in Chinatown or whether they're with the newspapers. My goal was to create, although it's focused on Mock and it's focused on Archana the narrator, but to create this little bit of a kaleidoscopic world in which the city, there's the newspapers, there are the people, and I think that is actually, also I feel like politics permeates every aspect of our lives, even if we don't want to think about it, and that was also something I was trying to think of, and how our city is organized also affects all of us, so I hope I've managed to convey all of that in the book.
Second question. You mentioned at the beginning that you telescoped time, the Opera House massacre, with the rest of the story. Why did you choose to modify time that way?
Yeah, so that event happened in 1905, and then this thing happens in 1907. Everything else happens in 1907. I did it because I tried to write it with keeping the chronology absolutely exact, and it kind of loses a little bit of its of the drama. And so then to be like, oh, this happened in 1905, and then fast forward 2 years and that city, it just becomes too complicated it just worked better dramatically in that case. But that is one of I did try to do it without, and it just sort of didn't work, so. Yeah.
Hi. This is your second book on Chinese narrative. No?
No, my first. My two previous books are totally separate.
Yes, I was here.
Well, it was the same book.
It's the same book.
Yes, it's the same book. At that time, it had not been published.
Oh, okay. So I was a little confused.
Yeah.
So the follow-up question was, since this is not your first, not the only kind of stories that you have written, you have others, and what were they?
So the other two books, yeah, also they're set in New York City in 1915 and 1916, while World War I is just beginning in Europe. They also have a journalist as the main character, and I find that character sort of a useful character because it allows me to deal with politics as well as things happening locally in one character. But the main character in those books is white because, as I was saying, I really just couldn't bring myself to think of an Indian person in the US at that time.
Yeah, is there any historical fiction based in Chinatown, either New York or elsewhere, that you recommend or were inspired by for this book?
Historical fiction set in Chinatown.
Question for Alvin as well.
Well, I guess the first New York Chinatown novel was Eat a Bowl of Tea by Louis Chu. And and of course someone who shared the stage with us. I say, I always say we all become period pieces a lot quicker than we think.
Yeah.
So Henry Chang's been writing about a lot of
But in this,
yes.
yeah.
Street.
Yes,
Well, not King,
that's not
Street.
that's not fiction.
Yeah, so Ava's Mott Street is a great book. It's, not fiction. And Henry Chang's stuff is in the 70s.
Yeah, Ed Lynch is in the 70s too.
Right.
Yeah, and so I didn't want to look at, sometimes I try not to look at people whose work is too close because you just get very influenced by what they're doing. So I try not to, and actually when I'm writing, I don't even read other mysteries. I usually then just read nonfiction because I find it that I'll unconsciously start to imitate what someone else is doing, and I want to try to avoid that.
Okay, just want to wrap up with just two things. Well, what's next for you?
Well, I think I'm going to do some nonfiction. I have some fiction ideas, but I think I want to do some nonfiction because actually writing this book made me think about India more, and so I feel like I would like to write some nonfiction about India, but also maybe I would like to write something longer about that one woman who wrote this book about conditions of life in the United States. So that's something I'm thinking of.
And now that you've had time to process some of the questions, is there still one more question that you wish someone would ask you? I think we covered it. Well, thank you for writing this fascinating novel. You look tonight, and thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you for Think Chinatown having us.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. If you want a copy of Doyers Street, they're being sold out in the outer room, and Radha is very happy to sign them for you and stay for a little bit and chat one-on-one. And again, there's still snacks. And if you look at the counter, we have a copy of the Man Farlow menu from 1904, the Pell Street restaurant. And you can try to guess which of our snacks corresponds to the menu item on that menu from 1904. I'll give you a hint. If you speak Toisan, mahong is a candy. You know better. And then there's gimgit, ma, oh my. And then there's gimgit, which is
It's
right.
Ma is molasses.
Ah. So anyway, pop quiz next time. If you want to come to the next event, the Anna Mae Wong screening, it is sold out. But we often get a drop off. So like today we had over 40 people sign up. So some people sign up and they don't show up. So get on the waiting list. And then if you want to take the playwriting workshop with Alvin on the 26th, also sign up because those also fill up quickly. Both events are free. The playwriting workshop also includes dinner, right, Alvin?
Yes, it is. Yes, and it's being catered. We're not cooking it.
We're not cooking, it's being catered. So thank you all for coming out. Get on the Think Chinatown mailing list, and hope to see you at future events. Good night.